Okay, so we are going to start working through our week one PowerPoints here for the first chapter, where we'll introduce some important concepts about American government and then also talk about the Declaration of Independence and its importance for American government. So, um, first off, though, I want to start by going back to a little bit of what we talked about in the introduction when we worked through the syllabus. The first question is, why study government? Is this just a prerequisite that you have to do, and therefore you have to sit and put up with my lectures and whatnot? Um, it turns out it's actually important to study government, and even at whatever stage of life you find yourself in, the older I think that you get, the more that you begin to understand that government policies of the state and federal government have an effect on your daily life. So, as I mentioned in the intro, the first and easiest place to bring that home is on student loans, right? So, looking at the current rates for students' loans, you see 6.8%, 7.9%, proposing to do new laws that would reduce the interest rate for student loans. Now, why is that important? Well, if you have six-figure student loans by the end of your time, and hopefully most of you don't, but for easy math, if you had a $100,000 loan and you're cranking out at 8% interest, right? So 8% um, of your $100,000 loan every year is going to interest. All right, so it compounds annually. So $8,000, um, and if you think about that, so that's $1,000 for 8 of the 12 months of the year. So 3/4 of the first year of payments that you make on your student loans would be going towards just interest, right? It doesn't actually reduce the principal. So the principal of the loan is $100,000. That's how much loan you took out. And at 8% interest, that means 8% every year is being added on to that loan. And easy math, 8% of 100,000 is $8,000. So $1,000 a month for the first 8 months is solely to interest, right? And when you think about that, that's a significant chunk of change with a six-figure loan. The remaining months of that year, you're paying down a little bit of principal, right? But not much. And so then you start out the next year, and it's another 8,000. And every year, the first 8,000 of your student loan payment, in reducing numbers, is going to interest. Okay, and that's not reducing the overall issue because the interest is how much the government is charging you for having lent you the money to go to college. So the rate that you have for interest um, for student loans is incredibly important because if you have to start thinking, all right, well, what's my apartment rent? How much does it cost to have a car? What are my eating expenses? Entertainment expenses? Got to have the internet, got to have the smartphone. All that stuff adds up, and if you're dumping $1,000 on student loans in addition to that, you can see that your first job um, is going to have to pay really well, and those are few and far between as a result of recession. So I don't mean to scare you as much as I mean to just kind of bring home how important it is that you follow government, you get involved in government, you look at issues like this, you consider issues like this. As you can see on the projected interest rates where they're supposed to go, a lot of people think that interest rates will be going up. Okay, they've been historically low as a result of recession to keep people lending money. So when the recession hit, banks did not want to lend money because they were concerned they weren't going to get paid back because so many weren't getting paid back when the recession hit. So the government artificially kept interest rates low to encourage borrowing and lending and all those kind of things. And so now that the economy's recovered, banks and other folks are wanting to charge more interest because things are more stable and we don't need ridiculously low interest rates to keep the economy and prop it up. Student loan debt has nearly quadrupled since 2003. So I graduated in 2002 from undergrad and 2005 from law school at the University of Iowa. And as you can see there, even since I graduated, things have really gone through the roof in terms of the cost of education and student loan debt and those kind of things. And we have data up to 2013 on this graph, but I'm assuming it's continuing to go up because the cost of education is continuing to go up. So in light of all that, last year there was a speech that President Obama gave where he tried to address the student loan issues. Now keep in mind, one of Obama's key constituents at this time were younger voters, right? So he wants to hit on an issue that will catch younger voters' attention. Both sides, both the Republicans and Democrats, know this is an issue, and each one of them are trying to think of plans. So this was Obama's idea. And he's saying, all right, well, you really shouldn't have to, when you're a senior in high school, decide based on whether you can pay for it or not. We want everybody to go to college, and we don't want the cost of it or the loan factors to really deter you from getting better training, getting better education, because the more training and education we have for you, it improves the economy as a whole, right? It makes a more educated workforce and keeps America on the top of the food chain. So part of it was you're going to do what was called a pay-as-you-earn program. So this basically, instead of saying, all right, well, once you graduate, we're just going to look at what your loans are, what the interest rate are. We're going to spread those payments over a number of years, and that's what your payment is going to be based on, period. The Obama plan proposed to say, well, let's not just look at what that number would be, 30 years payback period for a $100,000 loan at 8%. Rather than just looking at those factors, the president was saying, well, with this pay-as-you-earn program, why don't we also look into how much you're actually making with your first job, okay? So then it would scale back how much you're having to pay based on your monthly income. So rather than getting socked with $1,000 a month to fit in with all the other stuff that we want consumer spending on to help prop up the economy, we were going to base your student loan payment on what your income was for that first job, right? And then we would track with whatever your income was, with being a percentage, 10% of the discretionary monthly income. So you would have to fill out a form that says, here's how much my income is, here's how much it has to go to rent, to food, the yada yada yada. Of this discretionary income I have left, 10% of that's going to be my student loan payment, and that's what I'm going to have, right? Well, you can think about the interest rate is going to be incredibly important for such a plan, and it's going to take longer to pay it back if you're making smaller payments as a result of it being based on your income when you first start out. But you won't be quite as scared because you can say, well, at least it's just going to be a percentage of my first job and not take up all my income from my first job. Okay? So the other part of it was you're going to acquire more from students who receive financial aid. Okay? So we're going to make sure that they complete their courses. There are some folks out there that sign up for college classes, get their student aid, and then never show up and withdraw. And those people are supposed to be reported and have their student aid rejected thereafter, because you're just trying to go to college to get student aid, and that's illegal. Okay, so part of that was continue enforcement of those laws that are already in place. Now, it's a lot of scare tactics, but is it still worth it to get a college degree? Obviously, yes. Okay, your unemployment rate is lower based on your level of education. Your earning potential, as shown in this graph, is greater, again, based on your education. So it's still worth it to be sitting here and listening to me and getting a degree and all those kind of things. but the reason we're bringing it up is this is an incredibly important political issue for folks that are in college. Whether young or old, the cost of education, the politics of education, and all those kind of things are important things. So, this has a big impact on your financial future, especially coming right out of college. So those are things you need to be tracking with at the bare minimum to know what you should do in elections and how you should be active in looking at government and how government impacts you, because right now with these kind of policies it's definitely impacting you. So the USA Today looked at Obama's plan and said, we're going to also start to evaluate colleges, and so they're going to look at student loan and default rates for individual colleges, and we're going to give them a grade about how well they do on that. The students' salaries and earning potential, number of Pell Grants there. So then the schools who get ranked by U.S. News and all kinds of other places will now get a ranking from the federal government based on how well they're doing on a number of these criteria that are important for student aid. So the schools would start to get a grade as well. Okay, so keep tracking with that issue. It's incredibly important to you, and that's a reason, if you need just a simple reason why we're here studying government, it has a tremendous impact on your immediate financial future. And I don't know how better to appeal to self-interest than that, right? Your first paycheck is going to be higher or lower based on what the government does with student loans. And that's just the way it is. And you don't really realize that until you're out there making your first job and you get your first paycheck and have to make that first payment. Okay. So, kind of some overall discussions about functions of government. What do governments do, right? Well, they issue student loans, student aid. We just talked about that. But there's more general things that they do. And we'll talk a little bit here on this slide about overall things that they do. So first off, um, governments maintain a national defense. All right, so um, if North Korea or Russia or whoever wants to start invading, Washington State or Alaska, our government will supply the military to go and defend our property and lives from invaders, right? So governments maintain a national defense, and when you think about it, it seems like a simple statement, but that's actually critically important. If we did not have a military and a strong military, right, then all of a sudden, um, with globalization and global commerce, things that transpire on a banking standpoint or credit cards or other things that um, we take for granted as being honored and being done correct. Maybe all of a sudden foreign governments say, well, you're a weak government, so we're going to start charging your citizens 15% transaction fee every time they do a wire transfer, because you're having to use our wires, or every time you want to transfer oil across Canada from Alaska, Canada starts charging us a terrible amount to pull out oil through there. And that's if we have a bad relationship, a weak government, then we can get pushed around, right? So national defense is important for property and national interests. Public goods. So now obviously there's debates about how much the government should regulate things like the air, the water, um, the soil, those kind of things. But I think everyone can at least agree that we like having building codes that provide us a little bit more stability when there's any kind of tornado, earthquake, what have you. Our buildings tend to stand up and hold up a little bit better than in countries where they don't have very good building codes. So a public good is a thing like a building code. It's a thing like the EPA that regulates air quality, water quality. Public goods like water and air, it's things everybody uses, and the government provides those things and regulates those things so that everyone gets their fair share of that, right? Police powers. So this is a little different national defense is from invaders from the outside. Police powers are to provide order within, right? So governments, the police officers are a form of the government. They provide order in the streets, we hope, and maintain peace at their best ability, and basically try to clean up um, things that are causing disorder, right? Um, so the governments have the power to police things. Governments socialize everyone into political culture. So part of that is, governments institute things like um, flags, pledges of allegiance, national anthems, um, Declaration of Independence, which we'll look at today. It's another example of the government socializing everyone to a culture um, that reestablishes the government. Governments collect taxes and then provide services, right? Well, the taxes and the services is where a lot of the debates are. What should we provide this service? Well, if we do, it costs more money, therefore we have to raise taxes. Taxes are too high, taxes are too low. All those kind of things come into play when we talk about governments. Politics. What is politics? So politics is different from government. Um, Politics is kind of the business of power. Okay, so politics is related to who has power and all those kind of stuff. Um, Politics determines who we select as governmental leaders and what policies they can pursue, because their policies are subject to politics, and their policies, being able to implement your policies, is directly related to whether you have power to do so or not. Therefore, politics is related to policies. Harold Laswell, who was a famous political scientist, defined politics as who gets what, when, and how. And the media likes to look a lot at who's in power, who's up, who's down. Did they have a good week? Did they have a good day? Did they have a good hour? Right? So you have these constant with the 24/7 media cable kind of stuff. Um, the media is often looking at, all right, well, what's the power rankings? Who's up in the rankings right now? Is Obama up above John Boehner? Is Boehner above Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader? Who's in control? And so the substance of government um, kind of gets lost a lot of times in those situations with the media. The policy making system. So we talked about policies, we talked about politics. A policy making system is how policies come into play. Well, what is a policy? A policy is any kind of regulation, rule, or law that impacts you or me. Okay, so Pell Grants are usually there's income and those kind of restrictions on there. A policy for setting where those income restrictions are is a policy, right? If you set Pell Grant income restrictions at, all right, anyone's can get a Pell Grant whose parents make under $500,000 a year, right? Well, then the vast majority of kids in America would receive Pell Grants to go to college. But that's not the policy that was taken. So don't go back and think you've got some specific insight here. The policy decided is where to set those regulations and rules. How do we do that? What's the right position to do that for? And in democratic societies, you have parties, you have elections, interest groups, and other different kinds of institutions. You have 501 C4s now and other kind of super political action committees that link institutions between citizens and the government and all these kind of things. They all become interconnected, especially in our modern democratic society. When people are trying to impact a policy, they're trying to change the policy agenda. So if there's an existing policy and we don't like it or we want to change it, or we've tried to change it over and over again and this is our latest attempt, that's an attempt to get onto the policy agenda, right? The government can only look at and deal with so many things at one time. Okay, so we can't have a hearing on Syria, Iraq, what Secretary Clinton did in Benghazi. You can't have hearings all at the same time on all those different topics because we have a limited capacity as humans to take in that information and convey it all at the same time. So we can't do it all at one time. So there's different things on the agenda. Well, what's hot on the agenda right now? What are we going to do about ISIS in Iraq, right? That's fairly high on the agenda. Fairly low on the agenda, right, is something like military aid to Haiti. When the earthquake in Haiti happened, right, that was much higher on the agenda. We've been down, that's been a long time from now, so we don't really need military helicopters in Haiti or helping out Nepal after their earthquakes. But we want to talk a lot about what we should be doing with ISIS. So those show things come on the agenda, they come off, they move up the agenda, they move down, they get addressed. Sometimes they don't. Right? Competing interests try to push something on the agenda and get it dealt with. Other interests push to get it off the agenda because they don't want change to occur. Okay? And so a political issue is simply when people disagree about what the policy should be. Whatever that end product is, if the existing policy remains or if it's changed, that's public policy. Policymakers are key to learning about American government because obviously they're the ones that help set the rules, the laws, those kind of things. There's three main policy-making institutions of the Constitution, three branches of government. You learned in third grade. You're still learning them, right? And we're going to add some more here in this class. But the classic ones, the Congress, the presidency, and the courts. Those are the three main policy-making institutions. So we talked a little bit about this. What are policies and where do they come from? Well, for instance, congressional statutes. There's a U.S. code, and you have Iowa code, South Dakota's code, Nebraska revised statutes. Each state has its own set of laws, right? Well, there's also a federal set of laws in the U.S. code, and these are actually written down. You can look them up. As a lawyer, I have to do that from time to time. They're pretty dry, right? But they're congressional statutes. So when Congress passes a law, it's a law somewhere in the U.S. code, USC section, yada yada yada. Presidential executive orders, right, or actions. So the most recent one that's gotten a lot of attention is the president's action with regard to immigration, right? So the president's action on immigration sought to normalize the immigration status for a lot of folks who would be deemed to be illegally in the country. And we've had a district court in the Fifth Circuit down in Texas say no, and then the Court of Appeals in Texas said no, that's unconstitutional. So we're probably leading to a U.S. Supreme Court case about whether or not what the president did there was legal or not. So that's the next kind of policy, a court decision. You don't normally think of courts as making policy, but in reality, we all recognize that they do. They make decisions that have a direct impact on the rules and regulations that we all have to live with. And no better example than if the court has to weigh in on President Obama's executive action on immigration, that will significantly impact policy. Budgetary choices, where do we put money in? Do we put money into this? Do we put it in that? Do we take it away? All of those are important policy making things, because if something, a program or a policy doesn't have money, it's not going to function. It's not going to have the staff to implement it. It's going to die on the vine and not be used. Now, obviously, regulations, the EPA says you can't pour gasoline in a river and get away with it, right? Well, that's a fairly good thing. And having a policy against gasoline in the river is probably one we can all agree with. So having policies implies that you're trying to seek a certain goal, right? And if you're passing a policy, you want to see that it works and works in the way you intended it. There's sometimes unintentional consequences. I work on a group that writes legislation, and sometimes that legislation works in ways that we didn't see coming, right? Or courts interpret it in ways that were unpredictable, or lawyers, or the EPA or one of these other governmental agencies interprets the regulation in a way you weren't planning on. But what you're trying to do when you're writing laws, you're trying to translate those goals into words that can be impacted and executed by the people in government to implement those policies. And we'll talk about implementation because it's not enough just to write a law down. The law could be the greatest thing written on paper in the history of mankind. But if the people don't take that same language and the government doesn't actually act appropriately in carrying out what was said in that law, that can mean a failed policy, even though the law was written really well. Policies cannot also be established through inaction, right? If we don't fund certain things or we don't place them on the policy agenda, our inaction is actually a political statement. So, talking about policy, as we discussed, you can make policies through not doing things. You can just refuse to do things and take it off the agenda, and not having it on the agenda itself is actually can be a policy statement. Okay. The definition of democracy. So, what's a democracy? Defining democracy, we have several different definitions that we can look at, and obviously different parts of the world describe it differently in terms of how historical Americans have addressed it. In the Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln defined democracy as government of the people, by the people, for the people. True democracy is direct voting on everything by the voters, right? And which was not really what we have. We have a representative system where our Congress people cast votes on our behalf on laws. We can vote in different Congress people and the president, but in terms of day-to-day policy decisions, our representatives actually make the votes on that. Each individual does not directly vote on those kind of things, because it can get a little bit unwieldy, and as the slide shows there, the founding fathers were a bit suspicious of democracy in letting perhaps uninformed folks vote on things that they didn't know anything about. In terms of how the textbook that we're going to use defines democracy, democracy is a means of selecting policymakers and of organizing government so that policy represents and responds to the public's preferences. So traditional democratic theory has several different principles that talks about how democratic government works. And Robert Dahl is a famous political scientist, and he has 5 criteria that are essential for the democratic process. So equality in voting, that's basic to democracy. Everyone's vote has to count for one vote, and instead of one person being able to vote 50 times, right, and having their vote count for more, we have one person, one vote. Participation and effective participation. You have to participate, and your participation has to be representative of the different constituencies and the people that make up the democracy. Free speech, free press are essential to providing understanding of knowledge, ideas, how the government is functioning, problems, successes, those kinds of things. Citizens should have a collective right to control the agenda and who's going in and out of Congress, those kind of things. And then citizenship has to be open to all within the nation. So those are Robert Dahl's ideas about what makes an essential democracy. So one of the big tensions in democracy is you have majority rule. So in a democracy, the majority, the one who gets the most votes, rules. But at the same time, in American democracy particularly, you're trying to preserve minority rights. So even though you may not win the vote, you still have the rights. So every time the Republicans or Democrats win an election, the other party does not lose their citizenship. They don't lose their property and lose their money and all that kind of stuff. That happens in some countries, right? Where if you're not part of the group that wins the game, usually a military fight or some kind of conflict like that, then you better get out of the country because you're going to lose your money, your property, because you picked the wrong side. Well, in America, you still have the minority rights even when you're in the minority party, you've not won an election, those kind of things. And so we talked about this just a bit ago. Representation, right? Um, the closer that your representative in Congress or the state legislature matches their constituency, so they're the people that they represent, the closer that we are to a democracy. So if your representative really mirrors your local town, if it's a state legislature and you live in a bigger city or in the counties that that person represents in the state, or from Congress, if the several regions that your congressperson represents, if they're doing a good job of matching the values and votes and those kind of things of their constituents, then this theory says we're getting closer to democracy. Minority rights like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, privacy, freedom of religion, all of those things are minority rights that are incredibly important, right? The Bill of Rights was all about that, and we'll get to that later in this course. But the Bill of Rights preserved a lot of those minority rights because the founding fathers feared a little bit was factions becoming tyrannical, right? Well, if one party or one faction gains too much control, are they going to be able to control everything in the government and culture, religion, all those sorts of things? So the founding fathers built in a lot of things, whether it's minority rights, the Bill of Rights, separated government, and a number of other things, state government versus federal government. They tried to cut power up in a lot of different ways so that one party, one individual, one side of things couldn't win and then take over all aspects of life and say, all right, well, now your religion is this. Now you're going to do things this way. I control all the press. Those kind of things happen in other countries, right? In the old European monarchies, if the reason it was so important that Mary became the Queen of England rather than Elizabeth. Mary was Catholic, and so if Mary became the Queen of England, then everybody in England was going to have to be Catholic, and she was going to outlaw Protestantism and all those kind of things. So that's part of what the founding fathers were reacting to. We didn't want that kind of topsy-turvy role with every election and change of power. We wanted a system that was flexible yet stable and didn't allow factions to overthrow one or the other. So, along with it, there's three contemporary theories of American democracy that we'll talk about in this class. So, pluralist theory. So, pluralist theory is all about interest groups and how interest groups work. Okay, so when you think about it, interest groups are lobbyists, those kind of things. Everyone always is down on lobbyists. Lobbyists are bad and they corrupt the system and all that kind of stuff. Other folks will say, actually, aren't interest groups just big groups of citizens? Okay, and if citizens are the ones that we're voting and we're trying to have a democracy, what's so bad about those citizens pooling their resources and their interests into a group that can then have more power than any one individual citizen could? Okay, so for instance, think about AARP, which is the retired person's kind of the elderly representative group. An elderly person on their own may have some money, right? But usually they're not going to have a lot of political power to lobby their state legislature or Congress to get what they want or policies that would favor their age group or their interest. Now, assume that same elderly person joins with millions of other elderly persons in the country and forms this group called AARP. Well, now all of a sudden, if everyone chips in $1, right, you've got $1 million to lobby for better Medicare drug coverage, more access to different types of specialists, um, different types of insurance, all kinds of policies across the spectrum. If everybody bands together, well, what's so wrong about that group then saying, well, this is we represent these people's interests, and it's just kind of like having a separate person that's influencing Congress, right? Well, a congressperson is supposed to represent it, all these people, both young and old, and all these kind of things. Well, they can have different and shifting allegiances based on whatever that issue is. Whereas um, AARP says, all right, well, we're going to represent elderly folks no matter what, and therefore we represent you clearly on these issues. And in some ways, people would be more tied and more beholden to their interest group, right, who's representing them to Congress and to the rest of the government than they are their actual congressperson, who they may feel doesn't close enough represent or doesn't closely enough represent their interests to the Congress because they've got a lot of other people to think about. For the AARP folks, they're solely focused on one group, and the elderly, they don't have to worry about what a college student thinks about Medicare, right? So you have pluralist theory says all these interest groups really are just a different form of representation for individuals and a different way for people to participate in the political process. And some people say, well, that they just have a bunch of money to slide to Congress people to influence them, and it's slimy and all this kind of stuff. Um, that's one side of things, right? Another side says, well, it's not that bad, and aren't all these people just getting an extra representation to the government, and how is that a bad thing, right? So pluralist theory looks at interest groups in a positive light. They would be more on that side to say interest groups are not a bad thing. They're how things get done in this country, and aren't all these little groups just like kind of super Congress people that go in and influence Congress and represent individuals to the government. Okay, so pluralist series that says the way to understand American democracy is really to study these groups because these groups are much more important than Congress and individuals and presidents and those kind of things. Because the groups are the ones that are really fighting over the policy. And if you want to see how government works, you need to follow the groups. Okay? Groups that lose in a fight over Congress, let's say they don't get a law passed or a law gets passed over their objection, right? If they lose in one arena, then they can take it to the other arena. So if they lost in the legislative branch, now all of a sudden they can file a lawsuit. So if you didn't like healthcare, and it got passed and the president signed it, well, now you file lawsuits, right? And we've seen several Obamacare lawsuits filed where you're taking the fight out of one area where you maybe weren't successful if you didn't like Obamacare. Now you're moving it into the judicial branch where you're hoping to find some success there. All right. Groups also bargain and compromise across with each other, with Congress folks, with other representatives, and this bargaining process is how we get policy. That's how this theory looks at it. Pluralists overall are optimistic about this process, in that by having all these groups, in addition to all the Congress people, everyone will be properly represented, and when a policy comes out, it will reflect the public interest to the best of its ability. All right, so that's pluralism. Elite and class theory says, well, don't really look. Groups aren't really where it's at. The rich people and the powerful are the ones that are controlling everything, and so it's one of these things that says society, just like everywhere, is divided along class lines, and the rich are always going to write the rules, and the very few, the top 1%, is who's actually controlling things, and they're writing the rules in government to try and ensure that they stay in the 1%, right? So they're not writing rules that hopes everybody rising ships for everyone. What they're trying to do is make sure their own world is preserved and protected against those who would try to challenge it. So they don't want kind of a free-flowing system. They want a system that writes rules to make sure they're preserved up here and no one can challenge them. All right. So now there's people and there's racial theories about this, right? There's feminism theories. There's gay lesbian theories about this, saying the powerful write the rules and oppress all of these other classes, and the story that needs to be told is how these classes react to the elites trying to suppress them. So that's how this theory goes, but it says we should study that class conflict, and with the eye towards we should always be suspicious of the ruling class because they're just trying to protect themselves and not really following the American interest. And the thing that I come away with from this class partly is there really a public interest, right? Everyone talks about the American people think this, the public interest is that. Well, is there really one, right? We have all these groups, we have all these theories about what those things look like. Can we really narrow it down in any sense and say, no, this is the public interest on this issue, or the American people believe this on this issue? We may have a majority of the American people believing it, right? But it's not 100%. And does that then mean that the American people support that if it's over 50%? Does it need to be 100%? So we need to be careful when we think about American public interest is blank, right? American public interest is, preserving a safe Middle East, right? Well, some people agree with that and some people don't, and it's based on, do we use troops, all those kind of things. American public interest is restraining Russia, right, from taking over any more countries. Well, again, some people will agree with that, and some people won't agree with that. And so, trying to determine, well, the American people think this about Russia, that's hard to say. It's hard to claim that statement and have it really ring true. The 1% crowd, there's the Wall Street folks, Occupy Wall Street, who protested against the 1% having too much power and increasing in power, and the divide between the rich and poor in the country. So this is gaining some traction out there, right? People are feeling that the wealth gap is increasing, and the rules are being written in a way to preserve that, and people are reacting to it. So it's something that's kind of real out there right now. Hyperpluralism. So this would be the other side of the interest group thing, where we say interest groups are corrupt, they've gotten too much power, and really it's not the representatives or the courts running or the president running the show. It's really all these groups. The interest groups have so much power, or the political action committees, or whatever it is, that it's really all these little groups end up becoming sub-governments rather than the main government functioning like it's supposed to. So this hyperpluralism sees interest groups as a bad thing because it's weakened government and political parties and things like that to the point that it's segmented the government. And if you have to go through these groups to get a policy done, that's not the way the Constitution was set up, and that's the argument anyway. Okay, so when politicians try to please every distinct group out there, policy becomes just unreadable because you're trying to handle each little different group. Challenges to democracy. So, just looking at something like Obamacare, how do you make a decision about a complex issue like American healthcare, which is so difficult to study that even experts have a hard time pinning it down on what the issue is. And then who do you listen to when they try to explain the complexity? Is that person who's explaining to you biased? All those kind of things. So how can you know how to make decisions about complex issues? Who are you listening to guide you on those things? Or maybe you're just completely sitting out the debate. What if citizens know little about the leaders that they select and their policy decisions? Maybe you just thought this guy or gal was a cute politician, so that's why you voted for him or her, without any knowledge whatsoever about how they feel about student loans, for instance, right? Um, so maybe you have very little knowledge about the politician's own policy decisions. Um, the money part, we just talked about that with elites. Our political action committees, with all of their money, control have too much control over elections. Do they have a significant impact on elections? And then also another challenge to democracy is when the founding fathers separated power so that no one faction could take over and really control things too much. One of the byproducts of segmenting power that much is government cannot get anything done sometimes because it's so easy because of the power separation to block one side or the other from doing anything, right? So does the whole system seem to back up in gridlock. Political culture. So this is just the culture you grow up in, right? It will impact you having grown up in America if you did, as opposed to growing up in another country, because the country that you grew up in has certain elements of political culture. All right. Um, so you may look at these things far differently if you grew up in Sudan versus growing up in South Dakota, or Mexico, or certain Russia. You will have a different take on what your culture is politically, right? If you don't have a lot of freedom of speech, then you won't grow up used to a culture where people can attack the government and political leaders and all those kind of things. So these are some different elements of American political culture. Liberty, Thomas Jefferson, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Um, it's a cornerstone in the Declaration of Independence and also a cornerstone of the Bill of Rights, trying to preserve liberty for the individual. Okay, egalitarianism, equality of opportunity. Everyone has a fair shake to rise as far as he or she can, based on the talent and that they've been given by God, um, and promoting political equality. So everyone has an equal one vote, one person. The things that we just talked about before. Everything is equal. We can rise and fall based on, um, everyone has the same opportunity. Individualism. So we're fairly individualistic in this country based on, there's the frontier thesis that says, well, hey, when we had to go out every so often, when America started out just on the East Coast and we had to move further and further west, when you went out to the farthest outpost and you started hacking away your log cabin, the government wasn't going to be there to protect you from bears or Native Americans or other settlers or any of that stuff. So you had to be fairly individualistic, and so a lot of those values of being individuals and having those rights and the value of being an individual um, can carry through. So, for instance, um, Batman, right? Batman is a vigilante. Batman goes out and enforces crime on his own and tries to do what's right on his own, right? Batman is very individualistic. Well, there's other people that would say, well, vigilantes are by their nature dangerous, right? We have processes. What if Batman gets it wrong, right? The wrong criminal gets thrown off the top of the roof or something like that. That's not the person who actually did the crime. It's some innocent. Well, the processes of going to court, arresting someone. I know Batman didn't try to kill people, right? But let's say something happened, right, as a result of his vigilante actions. If he would have arrested the person, had a trial, it turned out to be the wrong guy, we ended up getting the right guy. Wouldn't that be better than Batman throwing the wrong guy because he's a vigilante off the top of the roof? Because he's just one vote, whereas in a jury, right, it takes everyone on the jury to convict someone of a crime. And so individualism, that's just an example. We value it because we think vigilantes are cool. We think Batman. I like Batman. I like all the vigilantes are cool on the Old West as well. But when you think about it, at the same time, um, those kind of things can be a little bit dangerous at times because it's one vote rather than many. It's kind of anti-democratic sometimes. Laissez-faire economics, another aspect of American political culture. We typically like less regulation by the government of our economy. Okay, the American government usually regulates less and taxes less than most other countries, right? So in the Netherlands, your taxes are going to be much higher, and government is going to do much more. All right. Um, we in this country, part of our political culture is more of a free and open system. Populism. The common American citizen, right? This is what the American people think that we just talked about. We claim, both sides of the political debate and a policy discussion will claim, hey, we really represent the average American, the common citizen. That's who we really represent, and therefore listen to us because we have the right policy. And then part of also our political culture, we there may be culture wars, between liberals and conservatives and progressives and conservatives, those kind of things. Um, is there certain parts of political culture that are being debated, and how those are being debated? That's all aspects of what we look at in American political culture. Okay, so again, some key questions asked about democracy, um, and you may see these in some of your discussion questions that will pop up here on your discussion forums pretty soon. We already talked a little bit. Are people knowledgeable about public policy? Do they apply their knowledge to voting choices? Do American elections work? Are they designed to get everybody participating? Do interest groups allow voices, all points to be heard? Are there biases within groups? Do parties work? Does the media help with the problem or cause the problem of understanding what's going on in our political system? Is Congress really representative of American society in terms of, you can think of it, a lot of them are men, older white men, right? Is that really what the country looks like now, or is it more diverse? Those kind of things. Will it be able to react to changing demographics? Does the president look to the general welfare of the public, or is it primarily focused on the 1% and those kind of things? So government is growing, and it's getting bigger, and it's not going to get smaller anytime soon, I don't think. Some people like that. They like the fact that you get your student loan payments on time. Medicare pays the hospital. Other people says, the famous line was from Ronald Reagan, I think, the scariest words in the English language was, I'm here from the government. I'm from the government, and I'm here to help, right? Those are the scariest words, because no, you're not really here to help. You're just going to make things worse, is kind of the reaction. So government is getting bigger, but a lot of people think that's a bad thing, right? They don't like the growth of government, the laissez-faire economics thing that we just talked about in our political culture, and the individualism. The growth of government cuts against those other values, and people say, oh, I don't like the idea that I can't go to New York and order as big of a fountain pop as I want to because the mayor wants to cut back on my soda intake. That should be my choice, right? I don't like the fact that I can't get certain trans fats in my city anymore because I want to eat what I want to eat. So we don't like some of those regulations, but government is still growing nonetheless, right? So currently we spend about 29% of our economy goes towards government spending, right? And so those governments spend about 29% of our economy on goods and services in the United States, which is they're buying stuff from other companies. The government's buying other things and hopefully getting a good deal on it. The government alone spends about $3 trillion annually, and its budget employs 2 million people and owns 1/3 of the United States. So the federal government is huge, right? The American government has been more willing to spend than tax, and so we have an ongoing debt in the trillions, and it's going to keep going up because we're spending more than we're bringing in. So, moving on briefly to the Declaration of Independence here. John Locke was a famous political philosopher, from right around the time of the founding fathers, just before that, and he had the idea that life, liberty, and property were the most important things to be protected by a government. Locke believed in a very limited government, and thought that, well, if we were all just trying to start from scratch, let's pretend we were all in the middle of some prairie, and we didn't know how we got there, but all of a sudden we're people. We don't have families or anything like that. What we would think is, well, what's the most important things to protect? Well, I protect my life, protect my freedom of movement, my liberty, right? My freedom to go to place to place, and protect my tent or my hut or whatever I've got. That's what we would create a government for. That's what Locke says, right? So Jefferson took that language and then expanded it into the Declaration of Independence, saying, well, actually, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what government is intended to preserve, right? And think about the pursuit of happiness. Well, whose happiness, right? Well, maybe my happiness is, being able to shoot my guns wherever I want, at anybody, at any time I want, right? Or being able to drive as fast as I want in my car. Maybe my happiness, my pursuit of happiness, is unlimited speed for myself. Well, the government comes in and says, Kyle, you can't pursue that happiness. We have regulations that restrict happiness. Well, the restrictions of that pursuit is where a lot of the rub is in political policy, right? Do we let you pursue your happiness however you want, or is that restrained? And if it is restrained, why? Is there good reasons we all agree to, or is there not a good reason, and therefore we're going to remove that restraint? So here's an example. Here's our huts out on the prairie that John Locke says, all right, we all just wound up here. How are we gonna? What are we gonna do? Am I just gonna sit next to you and you next to me, and we're both gonna have the spears because I don't trust you, or would we agree? We're like in Survivor. If anyone still watches that show, we're gonna form a pact, right? We don't. I trust you and you trust me because I've been looking at you for a week now, but I don't trust this guy and I really don't trust these guys, right? So if either one of these tries to come and take our huts, I'll defend you, you defend me. Well, we have a little pact there. We've got a little government, right? Well, maybe these guys decide to share their crops for the year, right? And defend themselves from each other. Well, we have a little state of this guy and a little state of that guy. We got a little government going on, and they've come together to preserve their lives, defend from these crazy guys, their property. They don't want their huts knocked down, and their liberty, right? If these guys come after me, you'll come after them, and we'll be able to defend ourselves. So that's just a picture of Locke's state of nature. So a little bit more on that. Prior to government, we were free, and this is kind of a thought experiment. We were free, we were all equal, and we all had rational minds. And we were individuals, right? We were focused on individuals. So why, since we were in this great state of being free, we were all equal, we're walking around the prairie, why would we create a government in that situation? Or why would we do that? And what kind of government would we create if we were in that situation? Well, if we were all out in the prairie, we would primarily create a limited government so that we could protect ourselves from our lives, liberty, and property. We'd have limited government over laws that says we can't do this to property, you can't do this to lives. You'd have impartial judges to just figure those out, and you'd have enforcement of those things. You'd have the rule of law. Okay. Other people come in and say, well, Locke got it all wrong because you don't come out, just plop down in the middle of nowhere and then start to direct a government as an adult male or female, right? That's not how you if you're rational, that's not how you were brought up. They say, well, no, in fact, you can't even think of it through that thought experiment. The thought experiment you need to think of is Well, you were actually born into a family. You had a mom or dad, or some kind of family figures, hopefully. And whatever structure you were in provided some structure that you know taught you a little bit about power and political culture. So when the mom or dad said you had to go to bed, you had to go to bed, right? Because you were not more powerful. You didn't have the economic mobility to move out of the hut. Um, and so a lot of people have come in and said, well, you can't really start from scratch thinking you're like this adult out on the prairie freely contracting, right? Everybody came up through a family. And so when we think about the thought experiments, it'd be more how would families agree to sort these things out? And it's a little bit different because it's not as individualized, right? You don't have just individual adults out there deciding what to do. You've got, well, what do we do about the kids? Do the kids get protected? How long do we protect them for? Do they get access to the community vegetable garden? All those kind of things that other people would say the Locke experiment is wrong, the thought experiment is wrong. You need to think of it more as a communitarian kind of um, thought experiment. All right. So we hold these truths. This is a declaration, right? Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. As we talked about before, how do we handle pursuit of happiness? Whose pursuit? When do we restrict that? We all can't do whatever we want. What standards do we decide about what we can do and we can't do? Okay, is it only anything that I can do anything I want as long as it doesn't harm you? Um, well, if I succeed in my crop and you don't, does that mean that I can't pursue happiness that way? And then the other thing is, right, are these inalienable rights that we come up with? Do we think of them as coming from a higher power, right? Right? Are these bestowed upon God or whatever religious background you come from? If there's a set of rules or rights from your religious background that have been brought down from on high that are sacred, is that what we look to for those rights? Or is that too hard to figure out and there's too many disagreements about that? So let's all just figure out what kind of rights we're going to decide to on the ground, right? I don't know what your religion says, but what can't we agree that we're going to do it this way, right? So it's a question of whether those rights come from above or below, and if they come from a below, then they're a lot more changeable, right? Because if they're above, they're sacred, sanctified, all those kind of things. From below, it's just Bob and me with our spears trying to figure out where do we put the community garden, right? There's nothing sacred about that. But if the holy text says gardens are supposed to be 50 feet from huts, that's better. That's what we should do, right? Because then that's a sacred holy thing. That's a bad example, but hopefully you get the idea. Rights coming from above, or are they just all what we agree to? Martin Luther King Jr., right? He talked a lot about this and hits the point well. Or the Declaration. Sorry, get to Martin Luther King here in a second. That secure these rights, governments are instituted by men, deriving their just powers from consent of the government. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to the ends of men, right? Rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers to such form as they shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. All right, so if the government's not working, right? Remember, we're declaring war against Britain because we don't like what the king is doing. If we don't like what the government is, it's our right to overthrow the government and establish one that's more in line with the principles of these inalienable rights. All right. Well, what about this U.S. Civil War? Wasn't the South pointed to the Declaration of Independence and said, "Hey, this government's not working because they're violating our right to have economic prosperity through slavery." Right. Well, you and I would say that is the most ridiculous thing we've ever heard. There is no legitimate basis for you to think that way, right? But that's them disagreeing with what an inalienable right was. And my point is, people can disagree about those things. Now we may all agree an agreement like that by the South was completely illegitimate, right? But taking slavery off the table, people debate about other things just as intensely today, right? About what rights are sacred or not sacred, or what rights we should have and or shouldn't have. If we don't have those rights, abolishing the government, right? So we did have a time in our country's history in the U.S. Civil War where the South said system doesn't work for us. It's not preserving our life, liberty, and property in pursuit of happiness. Our pursuit of happiness is maintaining slave culture and the way we like things, right? And the North said, no, you can't do that anymore. And today we say that's the one of the worst bases for people to have ever fought for anything. But back then they thought, wait, this is our pursuit of happiness. So the idea is, yeah, we think the South is bonkers now. Back in the day, they didn't think so, right? It was a hot debate about what they felt like, and today we debate other things, not slavery or anything like that, but we debate other things um, that maybe down the line we'll think, boy, that was bonkers for us to ever debate those kind of things. Now we're into Martin Luther King Jr. So there's two types of laws: just laws and unjust law. A just law is man-made code that squares with moral law. All right, so MLK Jr. is saying, well, a just law is a man-made law that we all agreed to on the ground that matches the sacred law, the moral law, right? An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. So Martin Luther King Jr. is saying there's a higher sacred moral law that's superior to the human law. So it's not just what we all agree to on the ground. There's something higher that we are responsible to. And the only kind of just laws are the ones that are man-made that match the moral law. And if you have one that is bumping up and doesn't square with the moral law, that's unjust. And we don't have to. It's not rooted in eternal law, and therefore we don't have to abide by it. So when Martin Luther King Jr. gives his "I Have a Dream" speech, he says, in a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. We wrote this check that said life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. And when the architects like Thomas Jefferson wrote the words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were writing a check to which every American could cash, right? Promise all men, yes, even black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed unalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. America, MLK Jr. says, and I Have a Dream speech, has defaulted on that note insofar as the citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check that's come back insufficient funds. So MLK Jr. at I Have a Dream speech is saying, well, you promised all these things in the Declaration of Independence, and the check bounced, right? We didn't carry through with your promise. But we refuse to believe that moral law is gone and that those words are empty, right? We refuse to say that there's insufficient funds from the founding fathers and all that. And so we've come to cash a check that will give us the rights of freedom and security of justice. I have a dream one day this nation will rise up and live out to the true meanings of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, right? So Martin Luther King Jr. talking about higher law, lower law, we need to match those up, right? So again, the Declaration is in the Constitution. But it's seen as part of the founding documents that we hold dear, right? The Declaration and this rhetoric of the Declaration, assuring equal rights, assuring that inalienable rights are protected, people can appeal back, just like Martin Luther King Jr. did, and said, well, America hasn't fulfilled this promise because we're not doing this, right? We aren't equal, or we haven't made good on the promise because of this policy or that policy. And so that rhetorical device of being able to appeal back to the Declaration is a powerful tool for policy in America, right? You can say we're not doing something that we promised to do at the very beginning. That's a powerful tool to help change government, and we see it used time and time again. So many civil rights issues today, separation of church and state, those kind of things, are fights over those kind of issues. Okay, so we ended our last discussion of the Declaration, one of the key questions that we had was unalienable rights. These are rights that can't be changed. They're human rights that no government can take away and no human can take away from another human. And so the question is there a danger in treating human rights as being derived from common consent? So remember we talked about, do rights come up from up above, or do we all agree to them amongst ourselves? And the question is there a danger from just agreeing amongst ourselves as to what they are going to be, as opposed to seeing them as coming from above, rights that we are created with that have a kind of divine origin or a higher power origin um, based on a faith background of some sort. And the danger of treating human rights as commonly derived is that obviously we can change those. Now, other people will say, well, yeah, but we won't change them to vote them out. But on the other hand, you can imagine there being votes on whether we have the freedom of speech or whether we have the freedom of religion. If it's all based on whether or not what we agree to here on the ground, then obviously that can be outvoted, that can be changed. Whereas if there's a higher moral law, as Martin Luther King Jr. talked about, then we can't change that. Right? To change it would be unjust. As Martin Luther King Jr. said back here, there's two types of law. Man-made law that squares with the moral code, that's a just law, or an unjust law is one that's out of harmony with the moral law, right? So there's a higher moral law that we judge man-made laws with. Well, if we're all agreeing that there is no moral law, then we all are all just agreeing to the moral law and the man-made law. There isn't any difference. If there is no higher standard and we're all just voting on things, then that's the difference, right? Other people will say, well, there's danger in talking about a moral law because we all disagree about what truly is a moral law, or we all disagree about what is the higher power, those kind of things. So that's the tension that we live with on this. This is a famous painting, right? School of Athens. And in the middle there, we'll get a close up here in a little bit. This is all the famous philosophers in Greece, and in the middle is Plato and Aristotle. And so here's a close up. On the left is Plato, and he's pointing up to the sky. And then on the right there is Aristotle, and he's gesturing towards the ground. And this is meant just to symbolize Plato saw in his philosophy there were perfect forms, right? There was the perfection of democracy, perfection of a circle, perfection of a cat. All of these, there was this perfect existence of these things out there. So there was perfect forms of ideas, individuals, animals, all kinds of things. There were perfect forms that existed. But all we were seeing in reality were shadows of the perfect form. So we weren't seeing the real form. We were just seeing shadows of it, or imperfections of the real thing. And so Plato said the philosopher is the one that can get out of the cave, right? Or Plato's cave. Most people are just seeing shadows dancing on the fire from the outside. The philosopher can get out of the cave and see into the light and see the true forms. And the philosopher king, we should then make philosophers the kings because they're the ones that are able to see the true forms and all that kind of stuff. So Plato says, we look to above. There are these perfect forms. We can reason our way to figuring out what the perfection of democracy is, what perfect human rights are, and we can take those things and then apply them to life on the ground. Aristotle, on the other hand, says, I don't know about all this Plato stuff. And he gives, he doesn't trash Plato, but he says, I think we should decide more based on what a common consent is amongst the people here on Earth, right? We can't all know what the forms are. We can agree that we think you have a human right to be fed, right, and not murdered or not raped and those kind of things. So Aristotle gestures down on the ground. Let's not look for our rules and our government and our policies by looking at the perfect forms. Let's look more here and govern it by the ground. So that's the tension in a lot of our government, right? Is figuring out, well, what standards should we be looking at? Standards that are kind of otherworldly to govern our behavior, and then have our policies informed by those kind of ideas, or are we all just making it up on our own, and therefore it's just based on political power here on